Today we're going to be talking about nutrient dynamics and uptake. My name is Jack. I'm the founder of Cultra, a nutrient analytics software for crop consultants. What we need to look at when we're figuring out where our bottlenecks are is through these tests. A soil test tells you the presence, right? And you have a strong acid soil test, and you have weak acid soil tests, like things like the Haney test that are closer to uptake than just presence. And then you have the uptake. You have plant sap and you have tissue test. Did it actually get into the plant? Because it doesn't matter if it's in the soil if it's not getting into the plant. Who cares? But it is important to figure out where on this line each of our nutrients are. I'll give a quick example. So say we're growing 200 bushel corn, and say we know that at harvest that crop is taking out 100 pounds of phosphorus. So here's our crop needs. Now say we have availability. This is difficult to measure, right? There are new tools coming out on the market all the time to figure out exactly like what is available in your soil, so we can figure out what our action is, right? So say you take a Haney test that you trust, that you've known has a accurate amount for your specific farm, and it says, you know, you have 30 pounds per acre of P, right? That means our action is 70 pounds per acre P, right? But this doesn't necessarily mean we apply 70 pounds per acre of fertilizer in the correct form at root access, right? We have to go through that entire process. This 70 pounds per acre, we want to figure out, can we increase this number? And by how much? And how much do we trust our ability to increase this number to hit what the crop needs? So say you do an action like a mycorrhizal inoculant. Well, you know mycorrhizal inoculants don't work if you also are putting 70 pounds per acre of P down right at the root zone. There's a bunch of studies that show that the inoculant just like won't work because the crop doesn't need them, because it already has access to all of the P if we apply fertilizer down. And so what that does is it makes this number next season go down if we just apply fertilizer in the correct form at the root zone of our needed action. It can inhibit and decrease this availability. So what we want to balance is, how do we hit this and make sure that next season this number goes up? There's a couple things we have to do there. First, we have to know what this number is, right? And so we want to increase this number for next season according to our desired result. If you're on leased land and you have like 3 years and you don't really care and this number's at 0, then maybe you don't do that. But if you want your great grandchildren to be able to farm on the same land, then the goal would be to make this go up so that our action of putting fertilizer down just decreases over time. So our action has to be a balance between increasing availability and filling the gap. Ideally, you want to fill the gap without decreasing availability. For nutrient antagonisms, we have outcompeting nutrients at cation exchange sites. So you have your clay, your potassium nutrients, and you have your soil particles. And if there's an imbalance, then they can wash into the soil solution and move away, or they just won't be taken up by the roots because they're overcrowding each other. So there's a correct balance to these, and that's going to be the correct base saturation ratios, which, depending on your location, and like I know some people believe in it, some people don't with the Albrecht method, but I think overall there is competing between these 3 nutrient ions, and so making sure that you're tracking those and you're tracking the percentages that they have, and then also tracking in a tissue or plant sap, is something not getting uptaken by the plant? This is one thing to look at if your soil test says you have an adequate supply of a certain nutrient, but your tissue test says it doesn't. We want to look at Mulder's chart. If there's any inhibition, any kind of nutrient antagonism that's preventing something from a soil test to go to a tissue test. Okay, so between each of these steps, we want to figure out what's blocking it and how do we unblock this. So this is a filter. So this is something like you have phosphorus tied up in your soil. If you took a total nutrient digest, it would be off the charts, way above what you'd normally see on a soil test, but it's not in the correct form and it's certainly not able to be uptaken by the plant. So there's a decrease, right? So say you take a total nutrient digest and you have an insane amount of phosphorus in that, but none of it's in the correct form. Well, how does it get to the correct form, right? It gets to that correct form pretty slowly in nutrient cycling and weathering. There's a process of mineralization, nutrient antagonisms, and then there's also just inherent characteristics of the parent material of your farm that will always prevent certain nutrients from being in the correct form. Now, once it's in the correct form, right, we're talking about nutrient mobility in the soil. So what determines that? So you have soil moisture, and then you have root access. Root access is going to be a couple pieces, right? First, you have the actual length of the root. How big is your root system? How deep can your roots get into your soil in order to access those nutrients? That's determined by certain physical characteristics like your compaction levels and previous nutrients that were being able to be taken up by the plant, be put into the plant processes, drive those roots down and grow your roots to access more nutrients. If those things don't happen, you're going to limit your root access. You also have your mycorrhizal fungi. And the mycorrhizal fungi, which I think most of y'all know, attaches itself to the roots and then greatly expands the root access by a lot. So we have physical, chemical, and biological processes at each of these steps that are stopping the nutrients from getting to the roots. It's our job to figure out where are the biggest bottlenecks and then how do we overcome them. So the biggest piece of getting this massive amount of nutrients that are locked up in your soil to the correct form is through nutrient cycling. This is how you get nutrients that you already have into the correct form. So earlier when we were talking about the least amount of inputs to achieve your desired result, we want to make sure that one of those inputs that we can think of, that we can have in our toolbox, is making this piece go up. Now, when we apply a fertilizer, we're just putting it in the correct form, often at the root zone, for immediate uptake, which is awesome because it's already in the correct form and the roots can uptake it. However, what we see and what we've been learning is that oftentimes if we put something in the correct form right at the root, it can inhibit this. So say we have, and not all the time, obviously, but often if we don't support this nutrient cycling, it's going to decrease. Okay, so increasing availability is easy to say, but we have to measure it. It can take a lot of different tools put together in order to actually figure out what's your availability at for each nutrient that your crop needs, and then how do you increase that? A couple things we have: nutrient antagonisms, redox state, and mineralization rates, right? And then between form and uptake, we have things like soil moisture, because the nutrients move in the soil solution, compaction, because that soil solution movement can be inhibited with a high bulk density or low root penetration, and then AMF presence, because increasing AMF just exponentially increases your root access to get the form to be uptaken. If we're taking all of our measurements and we see potassium for a normal soil test is high, for a weak acid is adequate, right? Obviously, there's going to be a decrease as we go from presence to correct form, and then we're going to go from adequate to low for the uptake. Now, obviously, the most important thing is the crop needs the potassium, so we want to fix this. What percentage of our inputs to achieve our desired result go from adequate to low or from high to increasing this? If we focus on this section, if we focus 100% of our effort from getting this from high to high, but this is still low, right? We have failed at our goal of, achieving our desired result with the least amount of inputs. So we can focus here, but our bottleneck more than likely is here. What are some things that cause it from being in the correct form to not being taken up by the plant. We have things like base saturation at the root zone. If we have a significant excess of calcium, then that potassium is going to be competing for exchange sites. It's not going to be at a high enough concentration in the soil solution to be taken up. We also have things like soil moisture and compaction. The nutrients are going to be moving in the soil solution from the soil into the plant. And there's a bunch of pieces in this section from adequate in the soil to low in the plant that we need to look at before we just add more. Because if we add a bunch of, it may make sense to add more potassium at the correct form right at the root zone to increase this. That may be the correct decision, but oftentimes what can happen is that can induce additional downstream nutrient antagonisms that prevent, another nutrient down the line from being able to go from the correct form into uptake, or it could turn other nutrients from the correct form into the incorrect form and go backwards. And so we want to make sure that we're able to move all of our nutrients along this line in the correct way without using more inputs that could further disrupt what we have going on. Now we're going to do something else. We're going to do something like manganese. Now, manganese presence, high in a total nutrient digester strong acid. But for the form, right, if we are to take a weak acid test and we try and look at the correct form, right, if we try and do that same thing, which is decrease compaction, increase soil moisture, something like that, we can't go from low to make this high. That doesn't really work. What we need to do is we need to look at this section. So we don't want to really focus on this section with manganese, right? A whole lot for long-term fixes. We want to focus on getting it from presence to the correct form and maintaining that correct form. So this goes from low to high, and then this eventually goes from low to high. However, as we talked about earlier, we want to do the least amount of inputs to achieve our desired result. Now, all of our crops that we need for this season right now need manganese, right? So if we're focusing on here, but this is still low, this is probably going to take, this is a longer term fix. So we want to balance our short-term goals with our long-term goals. So that might mean fixing this now as much as we can, but making sure the plant actually gets it this season. All right, so we want to balance our short-term goals and our long-term goals. So our short-term goals is getting manganese to the plant this season so your crops can grow well and they can have high disease resistance. If we know we have low of the correct form of manganese and it's not getting taken up by the plant, we need to have a balance between this long form, getting it from the being in the soil to being in the correct form so it can be taken up, with actually getting it taken up by the plant through things like foliar applications or fertigation systems, or however in preseason fertilizer apps, which you don't know unless you test for uptake. So maybe you take last season's tissue tests or something like that, and you're able to figure out where on this spectrum you are and exactly how your management practices should be this season, whether in season or for preseason next. Let's do one that's maybe a little bit more challenging. Let's do phosphorus. We have an adequate presence, so like a 50 pounds per acre on a standard, stronger acid soil test. Say you take a Haney test or something, also adequate but on the lower side, and then your uptake's also pretty low. We want our phosphorus uptake, obviously, we want our phosphorus to get into the plant. So again, we're going to figure out what do we need to do right now and what do we need to do for the future, depending on your desired goals. So a couple things that we can think of is, first, most obvious, applying more phosphorus, right? Is that the least amount of inputs for the desired result? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, depends on your tests, and it depends on the trending of your tests, right? So say you apply phosphorus every single season. So if this is your phosphorus and it's trending upwards towards adequate, we should probably focus on increasing this uptake, right? But say your crop removal rate has been exceeding what you've been applying and your phosphorus is looking more like this, right? And it's trending downwards. It's still adequate, but it's on the low end. If you pull up a bunch of this phosphorus without replacing it or without making more of it go from present to the correct form through things like mineralization and measuring your microbial activity, it's going to continue to go down. So in that first scenario where it's going up, right, because you've been supplying phosphorus to your soil and over time that phosphorus that you've been applying is mineralizing and becoming useful in the form that a plant can uptake, but your crop's not necessarily uptaking it, we'd want to focus on this section to increase that uptake. So if it's going up, we've been applying phosphorus like a normal fertilization plan every single season, but our crop's not taking it up, we want to figure out what's going on with this uptake mechanism. So that will be things like looking again at your compaction and your moisture levels and your arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which are really, really good at taking this phosphorus, especially even from the just present all the way to the uptake. So this piece is a killer if it can fit into your program. Say we get it wrong. Say we over apply a bunch of phosphorus, right? Or this is trending upwards. Maybe it's trending upwards like this. We're well above the adequate range. And we're just applying more phosphorus every single season because that's what's on our fertilizer plan, and it worked last season when we were here, but now we're here, right? This doesn't have to be one season, this could be 3 seasons, you know? You're just doing the same thing every single season, but we want to be tracking it over time to make sure that we're doing the correct thing every single season, not just following the same playbook every single year as our conditions that wrote that playbook are changing. Say we over apply. What's going to happen there is we're going to have some antagonisms. So between this presence and this form for the other nutrients, this zinc, if we're applying this phosphorus and now the form changes from adequate low to high, this zinc is going to go from high presence, but it's going to be in the incorrect form because phosphate ion and the zinc ion, right, if this is over applied and we have incorrect things like pH and stuff like that, we're going to have precipitates happen. So we over apply something in the system or we make that system out of balance, it can cause issues in the rest of the other nutrients that you have on these tests that your plant needs. And now zinc went from high in the presence to now the uptake is low, and now we have to go through and we have to add more zinc in the correct form or do zinc in a foliar application or something like that because we weren't watching where the direction of our nutrients were going and being able to keep all of that in check. And so those are just some examples of how we can go from presence, form to uptake, and we can figure out exactly where in that process our intervention needs to happen in order to achieve our desired result with the least amount of inputs. All right, so to recap, we have crop needs minus availability equals our actions, and this is broken down by the filter of availability, which is presence, form to uptake. So if we want to increase this number, we need to figure out our actions here, here, or here. So we have in-season analysis or pre-plant based on last season's data here. And we have preparing for future seasons here, or preparing for this season with pre-plant amendments here. The key issue is we want to make sure that none of our actions further hinder another nutrient along this line and along that spectrum. And I believe the only way to do that is through really good nutrient analytics. And so that's why we built Cultra, to allow you to see all of these tests, to see your biological tests, to figure out how well are your nutrients cycling, your soil tests to figure out are the nutrients there, are they there in the correct form, and then tissue and plant sap tests in the uptake. So we built Cultra to be able to see all of those at once, so you can figure out exactly how you can put the least amount of inputs to achieve your desired result for your farm.